We're here today filming for the Hamilton Jazz Archives, and we're going to get a little different slant today. We've been talking to a lot of musicians about their experiences in the jazz world in association with Count Basie, Joe Williams. Today we have John Levy with us, who was a longtime friend, associate, and manager with Joe Williams, and we're going to talk a little bit about how he looks at the music business. And the business of music is something that sometimes musicians don't deal with as much as they should, perhaps. And I would have to tell you that yesterday we had a long conversation between Milt Hinton and Joe Williams, and they spoke very highly of you. And so I'd have to say you're doing something right over all these years.
I think they're just real good friends. And,
Yeah.
we know each other for years. In fact, one of the first playing engagements of Milt Jackson was in Philadelphia. He and I and Tal Farlow worked in Philadelphia. That was one of the first playing gigs for Milt, you know. And so that's how far back we go. We go back quite a way, you know. And we were talking about that on this the other day, and it said, yeah, we go way, way back. And so, or he has, I'm sure when you talk to him, he had some great experiences to tell you.
They had stories. And,
oh, they could talk for days.
I know, it was very hard to stop after an hour.
Yeah.
You can do part 2 and 3 and 4.
Right,
you know, but
right.
Tell us how you moved. You're a musician yourself.
Well, my story is all accidental, I call it. I guess I was the type of person who was always interested in the business end of music, right from the very beginning. And I got into it sort of like, as I say, accidental, because I had studied violin, and then I sort of picked up bass. And Milt Hinton had sort of, we were in school together, and Milt Hinton had sort of helped me develop that instrument. And I was actually just working in the post office and just gigging on the side, because I got married very young, so I had a family. And music, I didn't figure was going to be the thing for me to really
Don't quit your day gig, right?
Yeah, that's something else. So we spent a lot of time, you know, learning about the inside of the business. For example, at that time, the Musicians Union was very strong, so you had to, in each city you went to play, you had to report to the union, so I learned all about that part of the business. And by accident, here again I use the word accident, I was working in the post office, and the president of the Musicians Union, the local 208, which was the black local in Chicago at the time. We're talking about all this happened where in Chicago during that period. And he called me in and he said, I got a guy here, Stuff Smith, and we'll let him work in this city, but only if somebody like you can take charge and collect the money and handle the businesses, because Stuff is not reliable. He's a great jazz violinist and all that, but he's not a very reliable person. So I said, oh, fine. So I met Stuff, and there was Raymond Walters was the piano player that had been chosen to work with Stuff. So it was just a trio, violin, piano, and bass. So we had this engagement downtown, and they told me that there was an agent who booked Stuff, and his name was Joe Glazer, and that he was the booking person who was doing it, but he couldn't come into Chicago because they had a rap against him, some kind of rap, because he had been involved with gangsters. So
wrong city to come to, right?
So he said, you talk to this guy on the phone, and and you make sure you send him his commissions. And when you collect the money, you pay off everybody, and you send him his commissions. So that's how I got to know Joe Glazer, through this. And so right on time, the commissions were sent and everything was taken care of. So I developed an excellent relationship with this top agent. He was one of the top agents at that time.
Was he doing Louis Armstrong at that time?
Louis Armstrong, Dizzy, you name it, and especially the trumpet players. He had Red Allen and Higginbottom and that group, the Dixieland groups. He had control of all of these different groups, and Billie Holiday, and you name it. He Dinah Washington. He had all of these people, and so I got to know him first by just make sure I sent that commission into him. So he sort of got a respect for me as a business person.
Uh-huh.
So in 1944, we got a job to go to 52nd Street and open in the Onyx Club. And in those days, they gave you a long-term deal. So the deal was for 6 months. And Jimmy Jones, I sort of ahead of myself because actually Jimmy Jones joined the group. Raymond Walters was the first pianist with us, and he worked with us maybe in Chicago for about maybe 2 or 3 months. And then Jimmy Jones and I had been friends. I knew him as a player, and I recommended that he come on with us. And that's how the real Stuff Smith Trio got together. And then we came to New York and opened in the Onyx Club in August of 1944. And then I met Joe Glazer for the first time, this agent and everything. And as I said, I developed an excellent relationship with him and learned a lot about the inside of the business and how it all worked, and which helped me later on when I finally went into that end of the business. And we worked there at the Onyx Club. I guess we stayed there about a year. And I think I left. I was the first one to leave the trio. I went with Don Byers. Went with Don Byers for a while, and then did a lot of recordings with Ink Spots and you name it, different jazz groups. And Errol Garner, I made a series of records with just 4 sides actually for Savoy Records with Errol Garner. And from that one thing to the other until we get to 1948. 1948, I got a call from Bobby Tucker to join him to work with Billie Holiday. And Billie Holiday had been in Lexington, Kentucky for rehab from the dope. And she was coming out, and she was going to do a Carnegie Hall concert.
Wow.
And this was 1948. So we got together, and Denzel Best was the drummer. And we rehearsed out in New Jersey at Bobby Tucker's house where Billie Holiday was staying. And rehearsed for that. And then I can't remember the exact date in 1948 that we played Carnegie Hall, but we played it. It was my first time in Carnegie Hall. And it was the first time at Carnegie Hall that ever had just a trio playing on stage, so the union made a ruling for the future that you'd have to have a minimum number of 12 musicians to play Carnegie Hall. So anyway, we played the concert, did a double thing, 2 shows, and I stayed with Billie, I guess, maybe about a year. And we traveled, but I couldn't get along with her husband, who was the same name as mine. His name was John Levy.
Yeah.
And we couldn't get along.
Yeah. And was he managing her kind of?
Yeah, he was managing her career, right.
Yeah.
He was managing her career and mismanaging her
Yeah,
career is a better word.
You could probably see that it could be done a lot better. Yeah.
That really ticked me off because everything was backwards, We didn't get paid on time, and when you had to travel, no arrangements were being made for it, nothing, just everybody was on their own, and I didn't like this. So when they left to go to California, I decided I was going to quit. So I left that group, and this is about the time that I was just sort of like floating around. I got a call to come down to Birdland to finish out a week with Buddy Rich. And Buddy Rich had a big band, so I went down to Birdland and worked this week with Buddy Rich. And George Shearing was playing opposite Buddy Rich. In other words, in those days in Birdland, there might be 3 or 4 different acts. and in this case, I think it was George Shearing with Buddy DeFranco and Denzel Best. And who else did he have with him? Margie Himes, I think was the other person was with him. And this was that group that was playing there. So when my week ended with Buddy Rich was only for 1 week. George Shearing asked me would I join him for a couple of weeks until a bass player that he had that was working with him at the time could come back. He had to leave and go. So he had some problems, and he was going to take care of his mother or something. His mother was sick. To make a long story short, he never came back.
Oh.
And I ended up with George Shearing as the bass player, and in a permanent position. We recorded, but the first thing we did some things on Discovery labels. We recorded some tunes, things on that, and then Buddy DeFranco had to leave because he was with MGM and George was with Capitol, I think. No, it wasn't Capitol. It was MGM. It was the other way around. Buddy DeFranco went with Capitol, and George was on MGM. So that's how we sort of split up. Buddy DeFranco got out of the group, and they added Chuck Wayne, and that was the beginning of the George Shearing Quintet, the original George Shearing Quintet, which was Denzel Bess, Marjorie Himes, Chuck Wayne, George Shearing, and myself. And then we went on to record for MGM, and from that on, September in the Rain and all those things, George became about the hottest attraction in the business.
Yeah.
And we were out there, and I did all the business for him, in other words. Joe Glazer was the agent, and so all the contacts and all the arrangements for everything was done through me. And yet I was just a bass player in there. So finally I said to George, I can't do this and play every night, and we would work at a lot of dates on percentage, and I said, I have to go to the door and run back and forth and then come back and play the bass, So I said, you got to get somebody else, So he decided to make me, at that point, was road manager, is what it was called.
Yeah.
And Al McKibben joined them in my place to play bass, and I became the road manager. And from that, after maybe 6 months of that, we got someone else to do the road manager because the other business got so heavy, all the deals and everything that you had to be working with. I had to stay in New York more,
right,
and work with the agent. Because George, at that time, we're talking about 50 and 51, it was about the hottest group in the country. I mean, we were the #1 group. And so there was a lot of business to handle, and that's how I got into the business end of it completely. And from that day on, I never played again.
I would think that, for managing musicians, you had a really valuable experience doing everything that they do.
Yeah.
Because now you know what kind of travel they need to have, what kind of arrangements need to be made.
Yeah, and it was an excellent position to be in with George Shearing because they came from England, and his wife had been handling everything, and they knew nothing about what was happening as far as the business end of it in this country. Yeah. So, it was a valuable experience for me to be able to be in that position, but at the time I felt that, well, this is just a job, I didn't think any further than that.
Right.
Until we really got into it, and George said to me, we ought to form a company, and since you're out here, why don't you handle other people? And other people were coming to me to work with. So one of the first people was Teddy King, was a singer. George used her on one album, I think on a MGM album. She sang a couple of tracks on that album, and it goes back so far I can't.
Okay, well, we won't date you with that.
Remember it all. But anyway, that was my first person to sign up as a manager. And then I said, I was only thinking in terms of musicians anyway. I didn't know too much about singers, and I didn't, that wasn't my cup of tea, the way I felt about it at that time. So I did sign up people like Ahmed Jamal and Ramsey Lewis. That was one of the first things. And then by this time we were on, George Shearing was on Capitol Records by this time. And that's a whole nother story, how we got on that. I just walked into the office in Capitol Records in California. We happened to be out there playing, and I said, we were on MGM, but they didn't pick up our options and everything, and we'd like to sign with Capitol. I said, fine. And that was what we signed. Just sat outside. Yeah, okay. Yeah. That was it. That was the deal. But anyway,
This was early 50s, late.
this is 50. Has to be around 51.
Okay.
Yeah, that's about the time.
And were you like aware of? I mean, the big bands were still out there, although it was
they were still out there, but they
it
were.
was after the war, kind
Yeah,
of.
they were kind of
Yeah.
down. They were having a hard time, very
And
difficult time.
like, what
because
was the
that's
status?
part of the time when Basie finally broke up and had the
Yeah.
little 6 pieces. You
Right.
know, because it was really rough out there for a big band. So, but groups like George was really hot, and Dave Brubeck, and that was the hottest things going, playing
Yeah.
the colleges
Yeah,
and doing
college
everything,
thing,
you know.
yeah.
So it was really the big band. It just cost too much to travel, and the economics of it at that time
Right.
was even worse than they are now, and they're bad enough now, but for a big band, but it was terrible. But anyway, that's how I got into
Yeah.
that end of the business, and then one by one different people came along, and I knew Joe for years. I'd known Joe Williams, and when he left the Basie band, and he called me one day, he said, "Come and take this telephone out of my ear."
That's it.
And that
yeah.
was it. No contract, no nothing, just that.
Wow.
And the other people, I guess, came along through the record companies. In those days, especially Capitol Records, almost anybody who was anybody that came through the label that didn't have management, I'd get a call and they'd say, you know, in jazz, that is, you know,
Yeah.
you want to manage this person, or they'd recommend me, you know, in that way. I remember Dakota Staten was one. She was on Capitol Records, and Dave Cavanaugh, who was the A&R man for George Shearing, and later on for Cannonball and everybody. So a lot of the people that I had at that time was on the Capitol label. Nancy Wilson came along through that. Through Cannonball, I met Nancy, and it just went from one to the other.
Great.
And then all of a sudden, I found myself.
Somebody take the phone out of your hand, right?
Yeah, I needed somebody to take the phone. That's right. That's right.
Well, if
so it
Joe-
just built, and all of a sudden I'm managing 10 or 12 people, which is doesn't make sense because
That's a
you
lot.
cannot do the job. I learned that quickly. You know, that having that many people just didn't make sense. I had a lot of help. I had different people working with me, but everybody depended on me for the decisions, and,
Yeah.
and they want to talk to me about anything. They want to talk to the road managers and everything. My son was working with me as a road manager. He went out with Ramsey for a while. Then he was out with Wes Montgomery, and he was out with Stanley Turntine, and Freddie Hubbard. And yeah, so this was the time I had all of these people. So I guess we're talking now in the 70s. And then I got sick, and I had I was diagnosed as having prostate cancer. But it was in the very, very, very early stages, and I had an excellent doctor, and that cleared that up. In other words, I haven't had any
That's
problems
fantastic.
from it
Yeah.
since then. Although once a year I go and
Yeah.
make sure, check up and all that. But it worked out fine for me.
Great.
I was very fortunate. I had one of the top specialists in that field at the time. And then I decided, this is too much pressure, all of these people, and I sort of cut back on it, and finally down to maybe 3 or 4 people. And now, at this point, 2 people, which is Nancy Wilson, Joe Williams, and Henry Johnson. I work with because he's with Joe, and anything I can do to work with him is fine.
great.
And we're very close friends on that thing. That's pretty much the story.
That's great.
As far as
When you first started working with Joe, then he had come out of that, or he'd had to hit with the Basie band, and was there a conscious decision with you guys at that point? He said, "Okay, I did the big band thing. Now I'm ready for a solo career," or did you find a group to play with him, or was he kind of freelancing with different bands? And how did that work?
No. He went pretty much right into a group thing, musicians and everything. He settled pretty much on a standard trio thing, along with maybe adding a guitar here and there, or adding a horn here and there, and use that as the basis for his thing, which is still the system. But we still, when the Basie band was still on the road and going. He had to do a lot of things. At least there was a lot of offers because the relationship was excellent with Basie.
Right.
So there was a lot of times where they'd make offers to us. The agencies would make offers to us to join the Basie band for a special event, for one of the festivals
they're still
or
doing
whatever.
it, right?
So we just kept working with the Basie band, and that exists until today.
Right.
We still work maybe 2 or 3, and sometimes as many as 4 different times a year with the Basie band. And what we do then, we just take his own Norman Simmons, his pianist, and then work within the context of the Basie band. And we do quite a few of those things. In fact, we're going to be going to play the Montreal Festival this year, Toronto Festival this year, back to back with the Basie band. And we got an offer on the table now to go to Poland with the Basie band, and I'll know when I get back, because I don't want to know about any business while I'm on this.
That must be a lot of business.
So,
that's a major project.
yeah, right. Yeah. So I'll have to tackle that when I get back. And I learned a lot of things, a lot about the system by my experiences with George Shearing at the beginning, and traveling in Europe and Japan and all of that. You got to know all of the different promoters all over the world, and you got to know the system, how you go about going in and out of countries. And Wes Montgomery tells a story about, I wasn't with them, and he went to Spain, and he got off the plane, and he said, the guy said to him, your guitar plays? Yeah. So he said, well, they took the guitar out and looked in it and looked in the case and everything, and they had these dogs sniffing, for dope. And he was there, and the guy said to him, this guy, the head of customs, he said, so you're supposed to be able to play this thing, play something. So he said, it has to be hooked up. He tried to explain to the guy. And the guy said, play. And so he had to take the guitar out and play something.
Do something to prove it.
To show that he...
Ruth Brown told us a similar story, but it was in the South with the policeman on the side of the road.
Oh, yeah. They had, some of the musicians had some great experiences with that kind of system in the South, with what would happen to you in that instance,
When you started with Joe, as far as his place in the marketplace for records, was he billed as strictly a jazz singer? Was he a blues singer? What was his...
Pretty much a jazz singer.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was booked as a jazz and blues, and that was it. Nobody realized or knew his ability to sing, except people in Chicago who knew him years before, because Joe used to sing in a nightclub where you didn't even see him. The girls walked out in the...
You'd hear this voice?
Yeah, all you could hear was his voice, and he'd sing like a pretty girl is like a melody, and these girls would walk around, and you never saw him, and he sang a lot, and he'd go on the air, like I think he was with Jimmy Noon, and he'd go on the air and sing nothing but ballads, just nothing but pretty tunes, but nobody paid any attention to that. The recording companies didn't want. Here's to Life, we had that tune 4 years before Shirley Horn recorded it, and we've been trying to get to record it, and they would not. Nobody wants. No, that's not Joe. That's not Joe. It's a beautiful tune. It's pretty and all of that. And I insisted on a full orchestra too. That was the next thing, and nobody wanted to come up with that full orchestra. It costs too much. Why don't Joe just sing the blues and sing? Get a little group together, and that's it. And I had to fight. Wow. And in fact, I quit Polygram for that reason. Just walked out and said, forget it. We're going to do this. This is the next project, or no project at all. That was it. And finally, Telarc agreed to do it. And but we still had to do a Basie album with Basie first. And then we got the deal to go to London and get Farnham to do the Telarc, the full strings and everything album that we wanted to do and been fighting to do for years. The next thing we had been trying to do over the years was a spiritual album. We finally got that off from Telarc. So it's been a good thing with them because they've allowed him to do what he wanted to do for years and couldn't get on. We've been trying, every record company he'd been with, he had been trying to do these things because when he started out, actually RCA Victor did do some really beautiful things with big band and strings and all that. They never did anything with the records, but this was the era of A Man Ain't Supposed to Cry, I think, and some of those things that they did in those days. But they never did anything with it because they were pretty ballad things, and they didn't even promote them. They just satisfied the show.
Yeah. It's funny because you read about the rock and roll bands, and they have the same problems. They're dissatisfied with their record companies because well, we've done these albums for you, now we want to do this new type of thing, and the record company says no, stay with.
They want to stay with the tried and true, what they can sell easily. Yeah.
I wonder if they do that with classical musicians. Don't record any Schubert. Stick with a Mozart.
They probably do. I don't know, but that's probably the situation with them too. Yeah, because they want to put you in a groove, in a certain category, and that goes with everything. With singers and musicians, you're in a certain category. And you can't do anything. They want you to stay right in that groove that they've got you locked into. And it's difficult to break out. It's just, you almost have to be in a position where you say, I'm not going to do another thing until I do what I want to do on this thing. Because no matter what your contracts and all that, I've learned that a long time ago, it's the contract deals and the record deals with the company. It depends on what you're selling. I don't care what it says. If you're selling records and you're making money for the company, then you can do anything you want to do. You can make your own deal no matter what your contract is. But if it's just an ordinary thing, then you have to go along with what they think is best. And today's market is terrible because the people who are in the record business, who are the people who make the decisions, they have no concept of the music or what's happening. All they don't want to know about is, as they say, the bottom line. And they're looking for young people with no experience or very little experience, and they'll put the money behind them to make something happen for them. And then after it's over, they get another batch.
Tell them what to do.
They can tell you exactly what to do. Direct. That's what they want. And managers like myself, they don't exist today with the upcoming people because in most cases they are lawyers or accountants or something like that that do the managing. And they have no idea what it's about, but there's so much legal stuff going on now, as I call it, the legalistic legalese of the business.
Is it getting harder?
Oh, it's very, oh yeah. A person like myself who is not a lawyer, and I know about contracts, I know enough about it, I've been in it long enough that I can draft one and I know exactly what's happening with it. But they won't accept that. You have to be a lawyer because the record company can be sued if the artist signs with them without having a lawyer represent them. So it's gotten to that point where, like everything else in this country, anything you do, you have to have a lawyer almost to do it. Just like we make agreements, say, to do something like this for the school.
Right.
It gets to the point where this is unusual, just that you got a form, in a simple form to sign.
It's only a one-page.
Yeah, it's a one-page simple form to sign. Because normally, it's just pages. I have a contract, a Nancy Wilson contract that has 40 pages on for Columbia Records. 40 pages. And it gives you one thing on page 5 and takes it away on page 9.
And then it's got something right at the end that says, if we forgot to say anything in this contract, it's,
Yeah. Oh, they got it worded, you got to go through all of that stuff today. That makes it a little difficult, but...
Can I wind you back for a minute?
Yeah, sure.
You said, going back to Chicago, and you talked about the Musicians Union, and you said there was a black musicians union.
Yes.
This was separate.
Oh, yes.
And when did that, stop?
I don't know the exact year, but I guess it stopped in the 60s, where they dissolved the black unions into for example, in Chicago, it was Local 10. And Local 10 took over 208. and I think a couple of the executives in 208 became part of Local 10's hierarchy. In other words,
Yeah.
the people who took care of the business of the union. And in California, 47 was the major union, and I'm trying to think what the black union was. I can't remember what number the black union was, but anyway, they all integrated. Like, it was the whole period of when all this integration started up,
Yeah.
the schools and the whole thing, around that time.
What was scale like back then?
Oh,
I mean,
Jesus.
Milton and Joe were talking about
Yeah,
some
they
figures that I just found.
probably remember
They-
better than I do
you know.
what it was, but it wasn't much, I tell you that.
I remember Milt, I think, was saying that before he joined Cab, he was working for $35 a week, you know, and then
Oh, sure.
he went with Cab and like it tripled, and he said, "I'm a millionaire,"
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, well, I know. I worked in nightclubs in Chicago coming along, and made $50 a week.
mhm.
Yeah, and that was big money, you know. And it wasn't big money. It was, just enough to get by on. But my first experience of really making money was really with George Shearing, because up to that point, even with Buddy Rich and with the Stuff Smith things was pretty good and everything, but the real money came with George Shearing, and then of course the experience and all that. But I was fortunate, as I say, very, very, very lucky in my relationships with the playing days, because I was always with the very best people, and it was always, whatever the dollar was, it was top dollar, and I was very independent. I didn't travel much. My move from Chicago to New York was the biggest move, and I never went back. I moved family and everything to
Yeah.
New York, and after I'd been there for a while, and I realized I wasn't going to go back to Chicago to live, and I worked all the time, from one group to the next, and just until I got into the end of this end of the business. And then a lot of people ask me, "Don't you miss playing?" I said, I did at the beginning. I used to go around and, sort of really miss it, but and sit in whenever I could. And I did that maybe for 2 or 3 years after. Then I got so busy I didn't have time to do that, and didn't even own a bass. And for my 75th birthday, Nancy and Joe got together and got a bass for me. They gave me that as a birthday present.
Wow.
Maybe they were trying to tell me something.
Just in case you don't have a job as a manager anytime soon,
Yeah.
maybe you'll need this, huh?
Maybe they were trying to tell me, you better go back to this.
I think the musicians must have always thought of you as being on their side, you know?
That's right, and I was always on their side, and still am.
You did it, yeah. That's good.
Oh, yeah.
Because
when it comes down to negotiations and anything about money, well, what about the musicians? They say, well, we're talking about a tour next year with Nancy and Joe and for Columbia Artists. And they were talking about, the people at Columbia Artists was talking about, the sidemen, how do you want to work that? Okay, we know what Nancy gets, we know what Joe gets. The group that's going to work with them together, and we worked all the details of that out, who's going to play for who, and we won't carry a lot of musicians and everything. We carry a small group, and it got down to the point of what the musicians going to get paid. So first couple of figures they draw, said, no, they have to get more than that, and they have to get certain conditions and certain things for them. So it's always been, because I still feel like a musician.
Would I work for that, right?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't do it for that. And conditions, like, for example, a lot of times when a deal is made for you to travel to Europe or to Japan, they'll say, okay, Joe can go first class. He and his wife will travel first class. But the musicians, they have a travel coach. I said, no, you're going to Europe. I said, you're in a plane for 8 or 10 hours. You're going all the way to Japan. That's 10 or 12 hours. No. I said, they either go first class or at least business class, at least where they've got a decent seat and they're not cramped up together to travel these long distances. Now,
Yeah.
other than that, there's no deal. And that's the way it is. There's no deal. And they respect you for it. You know.
Uh-huh.
They say, okay, you know, if they want the artist, they'll buy it.
Was that harder for you to do in the beginning to say no, 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 or were you always that have that?
It didn't bother me to say no in a minute. You know,
Uh-huh.
a lot of times, because Joe is very easygoing, and he'd say, "Well, you know, but we'll do." I said, "No, I don't want to do that."
Hmm.
Say, but if you insist, you know, you really want to do it.
Yeah.
And but this is the deal. If you really want to go on and do it, and a lot of times he would, I go on, I'll play. You know, I'll
Yeah.
play with a lot of these. We had a lot of offers to play with different college jazz bands all around
Right.
the country. And just so that would mean just Joe and Norman would come in, and they would say, "This is the price of the conditions and everything." And we just the school starting out. We have this band and we're trying to raise money to keep it going and all that.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
said, "Yeah, that's nice." I
Yeah.
said, "But you know, we got to get this."
Right, we're making a living here
Yeah,
too.
it doesn't make any difference to me, you know. And Joe would say, "Well, yeah, we'll go on and play it." But now more and more he's getting away from that.
Uh-huh.
I can't go because it takes too much of my time. I have to go there. I have to rehearse with these guys,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
to take up the time. As much as I like to try to help these schools and all that, he said, "I can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
It's too much of a skill." Joe's 75 now, you know. And
Right.
That's
Right, you got to pick and choose.
Oh,
Yeah.
you do, and I, really pick and choose the things that are most important for his career and for him, and the things he enjoys doing.
Yeah,
It's like these cruises. He enjoys cruises, you know, because he gets with the people and he
Yeah.
mingles. He's very open, you know, and he enjoys being around people. But I turned down several other cruises, you know. I've turned them down. I only picked the best ones, you know.
right.
And go out on that and everything. And he talks about your school. He loves that. He loves Hamilton. You know.
Great.
I think he was there for George Shearing.
Yes, he was, and we just did Clark Terry.
Yeah, Clark Terry. Yeah, and he told me leave that time open. I'm going there.
That's nice.
They're gonna give a doctorate to George, or they're gonna give a doctorate to Clark. And he's been trying to get me to come with him. He wanted me to come this last time.
You should come. It's nice
And
there.
I don't want to travel.
Oh, it's right up the thruway from you, you know.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
Well, we'll get you up there.
But anyway, sooner or later I'll go with him because there's two things that he has blocked out every year, and that's the Kennedy Center, the Kennedy Honors in December, and your school
Wow.
that period of time.
We're in good
the
company
doctorate.
then.
Those two things. I don't work during that period. He
Uh-huh.
said, and that's the way it goes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know that. I guess you can go to college now and you can take the business of music. You know?
Yeah, that's a good thing.
I
It's a good
guess it
thing
is, you know.
because they no longer do. It's like when Milton and I came along. In high school, there was like college now. I mean, they had these bands, and every high school had a band in Chicago. And I remember the professor who taught the music in Phillips High School where Milton went. It was just perfect. You'd walk in and you get private lessons from them, plus rehearsing with the band, you know, playing with the band and everything, and it developed some great musicians. And a lot of them would walk in and didn't even have instruments to play. You come along, the kid, what they would do, they'd ask you, what do you want to play? And if there was an instrument left that you wanted to play, most of the time the trumpets and the saxophones would go first.
Mm-hmm.
And there'd
Yeah.
only be so many of
Yeah.
those. Yeah. Then nobody wanted the violins, or that kind of stuff. Most of them wanted the horns, and guitar was forget about that. There was no such thing. I remember John Collins' banjo play. Started out playing banjo, but anyway, they had instruments for the kids. They had a certain number of instruments, and you'd use it the whole time you were in school. The 4 years that you were there, you'd have this instrument to play and learn on and everything, practice, take it home, and all of that. But all that's gone. You don't reach that now until you get to the college stage.
Mm-hmm.
There's some high school bands around the country, but not too many.
Yeah.
Not too many.
Well, a lot of the people we've talked to have talked about their great high school experience, and it's
Yeah.
amazing the congregation of people that were in Chicago, for instance, the famous names that
came
were
out of
all,
there,
all
yeah.
came out of there
That's
in
right.
that time period.
Right.
That's
It
really
was great,
interesting.
and that was the period when most of them came out because they had that music education. It was a part of the training that you got. You had to have that. Everybody had to have a certain amount of music. Everybody in all the classes, no matter what your majors were, you had to have a music class. There was a class. They called it a music appreciation,
Yeah.
where they play records of the classical records, and you had to identify who wrote this, whether it was Bach or whether it was Beethoven or whoever was the composer, and you got to learn a lot about the general culture of music there. And it was a great experience those days. And it's unfortunate these youngsters now who need it, to me, more than ever. They really need this. They don't get it.
Yeah. If you were able to tell some future jazz star a couple words about what they should know about their own business, would you have any thoughts on that?
Well, today I would tell any youngsters starting out, the most important thing is to try to get some experience with older players or people who have been out there, because what's happening now is a lot of youngsters are coming into the business, and they make the records, and the records are sold, and they are hot records, but they don't have any experience about playing with anybody. They don't have the experience, and they don't really have a style. For example, when I came along, you could recognize the person by the style, how they played, the style. Today, these kids, you hear them, and I don't know one from the other. I listen to them, and I say, who is this, and who is, they don't have any set style because they haven't learned, they have the experience. They can play, and they play with feeling, and they can read better than a lot of musicians that came along during my time, but they don't have any experience of playing with anybody, so they don't get themselves any style, are able to listen to what these people perform. I guess Wynton and his brothers and a few others that came along did listen to it because of their parents saying, look, this is where the roots are of the whole thing. So you got to learn that first before you get to where you are, before you get to Coltrane and Miles and all those people. There's a lot of folks came before that. So
I suppose it depends on what their parents were listening to.
That's right. It has a lot to do with
yeah,
that.
sure.
It has a lot to do with that. Yeah. And as far as the business is concerned, I would tell them most of all, please watch your lawyers and your accountant because they're ripping these kids off something awful. It's just terrible. And take care of make sure your own money as far. Don't listen to anybody else. Sign your own checks. Make sure that you take care of your own that end of the business, unless you have someone very close to you who you can really trust, because they'll rip you off the way it's going down now.
Okay.
You get ripped off very easily. Guys make a lot of money real fast now, and it's gone real quick.
Okay. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion with. I've been talking with John Levy, who has seen the music business from a lot of different angles here, and it's really been great talking to you. And
well, it's been a pleasure too. It's really been a pleasure, Mike, to really
today.
Sit and talk about it. I just wish I could have prepared a little bit.
No, you had some.
Had some notes and a little preparation, but you called me kind of sudden, and I said, "Oh, what am I going to talk about?" Well, get all my facts together here because this year I'm 83 years old. So
congratulations.
You don't remember things so well.
No.
It kind of catches up with you. And so people say to me, "Why are you still doing this? Why don't you retire?" I say, "Retire to what? What am I going to retire to? This is the greatest life in the world."
Hey, you tell them to see this. You know where I was when I did this video? So don't tell me about working too hard. You
That's
know?
right. That's absolutely right. So,
All right.
so I really, enjoy it. I enjoy the business, and I enjoy the music, and a part of it, And I wouldn't know what to do it myself to retire. I recently moved to Las Vegas, and everybody said, "Why did you go to Las Vegas?" I said, "Well, for several reasons." I said, one of them was taxes. The other one was earthquakes. So,
And you can play golf with Joe.
yeah, I can play golf with Joe. I'm close to Joe, and now Nancy bought a condominium there. I said, so I got my clients right there with me. We all enjoy the Las Vegas weather and just taking it easy. We at that stage where we can sort of coast on it a little bit, not out there fighting it every day. So it's enjoyable, and I enjoy it very much. And it's been a pleasure doing this.
It's been a pleasure.
And I make a point. I'm coming next time.
All right.
I'm going to come to the school next time.
Great. We'll see you at Hamilton College, and as part of our Jazz Archives, it's been a real pleasure to talk to John Levy today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
A time of